Sahih al-Bukhari 1041. Narrated Abu Mas'udi. The Prophet said, "The sun and the moon do not eclipse because of the death of someone from the people, but they are two signs amongst the signs of Allah. When you see them, stand up and pray." Sahih al-Bukhari 1042. Narrated Ibn Umar. The Prophet said, "The sun and the moon do not eclipse because of the death or life, i.e. birth, of someone, but they are two signs amongst the signs of Allah. When you see them, offer the prayer." Sahih al-Bukhari 1043. Narrated al-Mughira bin Shu'bah. The sun eclipsed in the lifetime of Allah's Messenger, on the day when his son, Ibrahim, died. So the people said that the sun had eclipsed because of the death of Ibrahim. Allah's Messenger said, "The sun and the moon do not eclipse because of the death or life, i.e. birth, of someone. When you see the eclipse, pray and invoke Allah." Sahih al-Bukhari 1044. Narrated Aisha. In the lifetime of Allah's Messenger, p.b.u.h, the sun eclipsed, so he led the people in prayer, and stood up and performed a long qiyam, then bowed for a long while. He stood up again and performed a long qiyam, but this time the period of standing was shorter than the first. He bowed again for a long time but shorter than the first one, then he prostrated and prolonged the prostration. He did the same in the second rak'ah as he did in the first and then finished the prayer. By then the sun, eclipse, had cleared. He delivered the khutbah, sermon, and after praising and glorifying Allah he said, "The sun and the moon are two signs against the signs of Allah, they do not eclipse on the death or life of anyone. So when you see the eclipse, remember Allah and say takbir, pray and give sadaqah." The Prophet then said, "O followers of Muhammad, by Allah, there is none who has more gara, self-respect, than Allah, as he has forbidden that his slaves, male or female, commit adultery, illegal sexual intercourse. O followers of Muhammad, by Allah, if you knew that which I know, you would laugh little and weep much." Sahih al-Bukhari 1045. Narrated Abdullah bin Amr. When the sun eclipsed in the lifetime of Allah's Messenger, an announcement was made that a prayer was to be offered in congregation. Sahih al-Bukhari 1046. Narrated Aisha. The wife of the Prophet, p.b.u.h, in the lifetime of the Prophet, the sun eclipsed and he went to the mosque and the people aligned behind him. He said the takbir, starting the prayer, and prolonged the recitation from the Quran, and then said takbir and performed a prolonged bowing. Then he lifted his head and said, "Sami Allahu liman hamida," Allah heard him who sent his praises to him. He then did not prostrate but stood up and recited a prolonged recitation which was shorter than the first recitation. He again said takbir and then bowed, a prolonged bowing but shorter than the first one, and then said, "Sami Allahu liman hamida Rabbana walak lamd," Allah heard him who sent his praises to him. "O our Sustainer, all the praises are for you," and then prostrated and did the same in the second rak'ah. Thus he completed 4 bowing and 4 prostrations. The sun, eclipse, had cleared before he finished the prayer. After the prayer, he stood up, glorified and praised Allah as he deserved, and then said, "The sun and the moon are two of the signs of Allah. They do not eclipse because of the death or the life, i.e. birth, of someone. When you see them, make haste for the prayer." Narrated Azizuri, I said to Urwa, when the sun eclipsed at Medina, your brother, Abdullah bin Azizubair, offered only a 2-rak'at prayer like that of the morning, far, prayer. Urwa replied, yes, for he missed the Prophet's tradition concerning this matter. Sahih al-Bukhari 1047. Narrated Aisha. The wife of the Prophet, on the day when the sun Kasafat, eclipsed, Allah's Messenger, prayed, he stood up and said takbir and recited a prolonged recitation, then he performed a prolonged bowing, then he raised his head and said, "Sami'a Allahu liman hamida," and then remained standing and recited a prolonged recitation which was shorter than the first. Then he performed a prolonged bowing which was shorter than the first. Then he prostrated and prolonged the prostration, and he did the same in the second rak'ah as in the first, and then finished the prayer with taslim. By that time the sun, eclipse, had cleared. He addressed the people and said, "The sun and the moon are two of the signs of Allah, they do not eclipse, yaksafan, because of the death or the life, i.e. birth, of someone. So when you see them, make haste for the prayer." Sahih al-Bukhari 1048. Narrated Abu Bakr. Allah's Messenger said, "The sun and the moon are two signs amongst the signs of Allah, and they do not eclipse because of the death of someone, but Allah frightens his devotees with them." Sahih al-Bukhari 1049-1050. Narrated Amra bint Abdurrahman. A Jewess came to ask Aisha, the wife of the Prophet, about something. She said to her, "May Allah give you refuge from the punishment of the grave." So Aisha asked Allah's Messenger, would the people be punished in their graves? Allah's Messenger, after seeking refuge with Allah from the punishment of the grave, and thus replied in the affirmative. Then one day, Allah's Messenger rode to go to some place, but the sun eclipsed. He returned in the forenoon and passed through the rear of the dwellings of his wives, and stood for the eclipse prayer, and the people stood behind him. He stood up for a long period and then performed a prolonged bowing which was shorter than the first bowing. Then he raised his head and prostrated. Then he stood up for the second rak'ah for a long while, but the standing was shorter than that of the first rak'ah. Then he performed a prolonged bowing which was shorter than the first one. Then he raised his head and prostrated. Then he stood up for a long time but shorter than the first. Then he performed a prolonged bowing but shorter than the first. Then he raised his head and prostrated and finished the prayer, and then delivered the sermon and said as much as Allah wished. And then he ordered the people to seek refuge with Allah from the punishment of the grave.